Hey, Stellan Cousins, you already know what time it is. Animated horror stories. Dun, dun, dun. Animated horror stories. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. Ding, ding, ding. You already see where we at. SSG Animations House. Please feel free to go subscribe over there. What I want you to do over here is like the video, please. Okay, let's get into it. 3 True Urban Legend Horror Stories Animated. I'm excited because the last one that we did, it was a what? It was a good one. I might tag it at the end depending on how this one play out. You know how I am. But yeah, let's see. Let's see how this goes. Feel free to like the video. Oh, that's not in the window. Please go grab your blunts. Go grab your bottles of water, your bags of chips, and your blankets. Okay? Let's get up in here.
Urban legends and myths have always been something my friends and I used to have a lot of fun with while growing up. We would occasionally scare or prank each other, but apart from this childish interest, we never really took any steps to find out if these myths were real or not. That was until our last week in high school when we decided it was time to take the next step. My friend Jason and I had watched a couple of YouTube videos where people played games summoning myths and demons. From Charlie Charlie to Bloody Mary, the idea of encountering a supernatural being or spirit intrigued us and left us asking if these myths were truly myths or actual reality. A question that would eventually leave us all wishing we never asked.
I'm sure.
It was our last week of high school, and while most people our age were out partying and planning, I decided what my friends and I needed to do together before leaving for college was something we'd always wanted to do. My parents were out of town that week, so I figured there was no better time. I got on my computer and looked up some of the most popular urban myths to summon, but most instructions were either unclear or too complicated to carry out in my home. Eventually, I found a site that had listed numerous urban legends, stories, and instructions on how to summon, although warning against it. I spent a while on the site till I eventually found a game I had never heard of. One Man Hide and Seek. The next day I told my friends about the plan. Sophie was skeptical at first, but Jason and I helped her relax, and I told them to come over later that day so I could explain the rules and what I would need from each of them. Okay guys, this is called One Man Hide and Seek, and the rules of the game are simple. I continued.
Why you got a black
First,
character?
we need a doll that doesn't look human but has limbs. So Sophie, I think one of your rag dolls as a kid should work. Next, we cut the doll open with a needle, removing its stuffing and filling it with rice. I was interrupted by Jason saying, "Sorry, did you say rice?" I replied, "Yes, the rice attracts the demon." Then we clip our nails and put them in with the rice. We aren't supposed to put the nails of other people or else they might get hurt. After that, we take a piece of red thread and sew the doll back up without cutting off the extra length. Instead, we take the extra length and tie it around the doll before tying the two ends together. The site said this represents the doll's blood vessels and traps the spirit in the doll. I was interrupted again by Sophie and Jason laughing, but I couldn't understand why they found it a bit funny. So I continued reading the instructions. We filled the bathtub with water and put the doll in there to separate the spirit world from the real world. Then we found a room with a TV to hide in. So I was thinking the living room. We purify the room we're hiding in. Jason, your mom still has those incense candles she uses for yoga, right? Jason simply nodded and I continued. We'll place a cup of salt water and the needle in the room. Then we give the doll a name. Not ours and not anyone we know. Jason raised his hand before saying, "Lucia." Sophie and I didn't seem to have any issues with the name, so I continued giving instructions.
Who was that?
It was getting a bit late now, so I decided to hurry up. After that, we turn off all the lights and devices apart from the TV. Then we say to the doll 3 times, "We are the first it." Then we run to the room, turn on the TV, and stay as quiet as possible. Sophie then said, "Hold on, Why does the TV have to be on, and what happens if we aren't quiet enough? Are you scared? He said, laughing. I responded with, the room went silent for a while, but I continued.
Come on.
We close our eyes and count to 10. Once we're done, we get the needle, go back to the bathtub, and say to the doll, we have found you, Lucia. Then we cut the thread, binding the doll, and say 3 times, Lucia, you are the next it. Return the doll to the tub and hide in the room. We remain as silent as possible, fill our mouths with salt water, and search for Lucia. Most times, it remains in the bathroom, so no need to worry. When we find the doll, we spray the salt water from our mouths on its face and say, we have found you. Then we burn the doll and discard its remains. I looked up to see a worried look on Sophie's face, and she eventually said, so what happens if it's not in the bathroom and we can't find it? I didn't have an answer to that, so I responded with, the site doesn't say anything about that, but that's why we have to keep the salt water on us as protection. That's it. The concern on their faces became more obvious, and a part of me began to think, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. But I brushed the feeling off, and they simply went home agreeing to be back at mine by midnight. Sophie returned around 11 p.m., as she said. She didn't want to be out on the streets by midnight, while Jason, on the other hand, didn't arrive until 1 in the morning. I wasn't sure we had enough time to set up, as the game had to be played at exactly 3 a.m. But immediately, Jason arrived, we had it all set up in around 30 minutes. The ragdoll Sophie had gotten was green and was also missing one of its button eyes. But we didn't think that would be a problem, as the doll didn't look human at all, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, it was almost 3 a.m., and it seemed Jason had gotten over his paranoia, if he had any, as no one was more excited than him to play the game. At around 2:58 a.m., we turned the lights off, turned on the TV, and before we knew it, it was time. We all walked into the bathroom, and the sight of a floating rag doll in a bathtub filled with water wasn't as creepy as I thought it would be. Jason walked up to Lucia, picked her up, and said, Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it. Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it. Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it. He returned the doll to the tub, and we all moved back to the living room. Nothing out of the ordinary was happening, so we closed our eyes and began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Before I could say 10, I heard a thud, followed by a light scream. So I immediately opened my eyes to see Jason holding on to Sophie and laughing. We stayed laughing for a while before eventually deciding to finish the game. I returned to the bathroom to see the doll still floating in the tub. At this point, I was feeling more comfortable now, so I picked up the doll and cut the thread with the needle before saying, we have found you. You are the next it, Lucia. It was only as I said those words I realized something strange. Despite being submerged in water for a while now, the doll in my hand was nowhere near wet. In fact, it almost felt completely dry. I returned the doll to the tub, and we immediately went back to the living room and filled our mouths with salt water. After waiting for a while, once again, nothing strange happened, and I could see relief on Sophie's face. At this point, I decided it was time to finally end the game, but as we began walking towards the bathroom, Jason spat the water from his mouth and said, This was fun, guys, but it was obviously all a load of crap. I opened the door once again, expecting to see the funny sight of a rag doll floating in my tub for the 3rd time that night. But all I felt that instant were chills run down my spine. Literally. The bathroom was eerily cold, and I could almost hear my heartbeat as I was met by the sight of the bathtub filled with nothing but completely still water. What the hell? Jason said. But before he could say more, we heard a loud sound come from the living room. We slowly walked back into the living room to see the TV randomly changing channels from one to another before eventually losing audio and then switching off, plunging the room into darkness. I immediately rushed to turn on the lights. A look of fear was all over Sophie and Jason's face, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a terrible mistake making them play the game.
You did.
Guys, let's just calm down. Find the doll and spray the salt water on its face. As long as we stay together, we should be fine. Sophie responded with, "Why can't we just leave and go home?"
Because,
I could tell she was
girl,
completely bothered now, so I replied calmly. The site warned us against leaving because our nails are in the doll. It won't just let us go on with our lives, so relax. Come on, let's just find the doll.
How are you gonna say that?
We looked around the house for about an hour, all the while hearing loud thuds and sounds that didn't seem normal to anyone.
Like, no.
The phones had lost all signal, and leaving the house wasn't an option. The longer we took, the more things we began to hear, and eventually, we could hear what seemed like laughter coming from all around the house. It was a deep laugh, and we couldn't tell exactly which direction it was coming from. That was until the voice finally spoke.
Mark, Sophie, Jason, if what you seek is to return me to my realm, then come find me upstairs. But I warn you, I will not return alone. A soul must come back with me.
The voice was strangely deep, and the house felt extremely cold now. "What does that mean?" Sophie said. Jason responded with, "You know what it means." They looked at me as if asking what next to do, but I was completely scared now, and I could tell they were too.
You gotta go. You made us
Let's
play this damn game.
go find it. Here, I said, handing them the glass of salt water. No matter what, don't let the salt water out of your mouths, and let's stay together. Immediately, we walked upstairs. We could feel the temperature drop, and more laughter filled the house. Only this time, it was obviously coming from my parents' room.
I would have never.
Jason began walking towards the room while we followed behind. And as we arrived at the door, everything went completely silent. Jason slowly pushed the door open, but before we could walk in, he was pulled in, and the door slammed behind him. I immediately began banging on the door, but it was as if someone was holding it firmly in place. I kept kicking and kicking till eventually it broke, and I walked into the horrific sight of Lucia seated on Jason. His hands appeared to be pinned to the floor, and although Lucia's hands weren't even close to Jason, huge claw-like marks were all over his chest.
Spit the water!
I stood frozen, looking at the horrific scene of my best friend Jason being mutilated by a doll. The doll abruptly paused and looked at me for a second. I could almost see a smile on its face, but before I could react, it was immediately covered in salt water from Sophie's mouth. Later that night, I burnt the doll and discarded its remains. The phone started working not long after the doll was burnt, and Sophie quickly called an ambulance. Jason survived the encounter, and no matter how many times we tried to explain the situation, there was no way the police were going to be convinced what we were saying was actually the truth. The police tried for months to make sense of the case, as the marks on Jason didn't seem human at all, and his story correlated with ours, but eventually they closed the case, stating we had been under the influence and Jason was probably attacked by an animal that night. A conclusion I could only wish was true. After that night, our curiosity for urban myths and legends completely faded, and sadly, so did our friendship.
I bet it did.
I am a father now, and I still spend hours wondering why the demon left Jason alive. The sleepless nights are less now, but I'll never forgive myself for putting their lives in danger, all in the name of an urban myth. Despite my experience, I wouldn't tell you all urban myths have some truth behind them, but I know for a fact that you should never play the game. One man, hide and seek.
We won't. Talking to us.
It is said that people who drive trucks or buses on the road have the best horror stories to tell. And you know what? It's true. I may not have been on top of any vehicle when this happened to me, but the fact that I was on foot, running, made it much worse because I had no way to escape. This happened to me in Argentina, the country where I was born. When I had not yet gone to try my luck in Europe, I lived in the rural part of the country. There, we have different traditions and urban legends, but I always ignore them. I thought they were just stories that our parents told us to scare us. At that time, I was already a father, and I didn't really believe in any of that. My wife and I had recently separated, but my son Al's mother was traveling in Europe, and so that he wouldn't fall behind in school, we decided to have him stay with me for a while. I knew that the adaptation was not going to be easy, so I tried to get us to do activities together. And when everything failed, the only thing left was what I liked to do the most: go for a run on the road. In the beginning, I held back, tried not to go too far from our house, and come back as soon as he got tired. But as my son gained more endurance and perseverance, he was also encouraged to run farther. Al was a 17-year-old teenager, so sooner or later, he was going to catch up to my pace. One night, maybe we went a little too far. We had never run that part of the road before. All the times I had been out that way were by car. The place looked a lot shadier and lonelier at night, but I liked it. It had a strange sense of peace. We kept running with our eyes closed, enjoying the night, until a strong blue glow pierced my eyelids and forced me to open my eyes. To my surprise, the light was not coming from the desolate road, but from the pasture. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached.
Why?
I had never seen such a glow. What could it be? It even had something hypnotic about it. As I walked slowly to the grassland, I could see how the light became brighter and brighter. At that moment, I was in such a trance-like state that I had forgotten that Al was behind me. My eyes burned just looking in that direction. It was like a small sun directly attacking my eyes, drawing me to him.
Still going.
As I reached the middle of the pasture, I encountered the source of the glow for the first time. It wasn't a person with a flashlight, and there was nothing or no one generating the light. She was just there on her own, floating. I was going to keep getting closer until almost by reflex, I turned around and saw Al, just as confused as I was, walking towards that light.
Period. And then you
A strange
snapped
sense
out
of alertness came over me, and I ran to my son,
was like,
shaking him to get him to react. Once he did, we tried to run back to the road, but it was impossible. I felt very dizzy, and with every step I took, I stumbled or fell.
Ooh.
My legs and body felt very weak, and each step I took to escape was harder than the last. I started to cry and felt the need to vomit, but I knew that the only concern, the only thing I had to be thinking about at that moment was to escape.
Oh,
During that period of
right.
panic, I remembered all the urban legends my parents and grandparents told me. I knew
You
what was
remember
happening,
'em then?
but I refused to admit it. The bright, intense light had a name. That
What's
was
her
the
name?
evil light. Do you know what else I knew about this legend? That no one who had seen it up close had survived to tell the tale.
Oh, and here you
I fell once more to the ground, and as I looked ahead, the bright blue light was in front of me. It moved very slowly, but for every inch it advanced, I felt worse,
Where is
and it was
Al
even harder
at?
to escape. When it was in front of me, all I could do was scream in despair.
As you should.
Suddenly, I felt someone grabbing my shoulder,
Al?
dragging me along. It was Al.
Good shit.
The
bro,
teenager
'cause I
pulled
didn't know
me
where
far
you
enough to
were.
get some distance. With his help, I managed to stand up and run towards the road without falling, and when we finally arrived, another light approached us at high speed.
The car.
Surrendering to what was coming, we both closed our eyes, not knowing what was about to happen to us.
It's just a car. Get
When
out
I
the
opened my
street.
eyes, I realized that the last light was a car.
Y'all
and
keep
it
closing
almost
y'all
ran us
damn
over.
eyes.
A man got out of the car angrily, yelling at us, but I
Get
couldn't
the fuck out the
concentrate at
street.
all on what he was saying. Behind him, in the distance, I could see the light coming closer and closer. As soon as we saw it, Al ran as fast as he could. I wanted to warn him to get out of there, but there was no point. I felt I could only run with my son. The man forgot about us, and with a lot of curiosity, walked towards the light. The man walked through the huge orb of light, losing himself in the brightness.
He ain't shit.
Once he finished walking, he had already disappeared, as if he had never been there.
You could have told him. not to
Meanwhile,
walk into the
I
light.
could only run to my house. I ran and ran until there was no sign of anything. Not the car, not the man, not the light. We had escaped. The police went to that area and did not find the mysterious light, but they did find the car. That same day, the man driving the car was reported missing. The police questioned us to find out what had happened, and were shocked that Al and I had the exact same story. Even though they told us they couldn't take a report from a La Luz Mala as official, they believed us. Everyone believed us. Our family, the police, and the whole town. This story may sound crazy, but if you live long enough in this area, you will believe me too.
What? I'm over here and I
Today,
believe you.
I've settled with my wife and I have a very good relationship with Al. He may be getting on with his adult life, but he visits us all the time.
Okay, that's good.
No matter how far apart we are at the time, he always knew that I was his father. And just as I love him, he loves me, and he would never let anything happen to me.
I mean,
sometimes I see on the internet the news that happens in my old town, and I am noticing that the signature of the evil light are becoming more and more frequent. The only thing that hasn't changed is the fact that no one who has seen it up close has survived long enough to tell the tale. I guess we are the only ones who have survived something so dangerous. And from what I see, this is not going to be changing anytime soon.
I'm Zach Marshall, and recently due to work, I moved to Japan. Now, moving from the States to a country like Japan is a big cultural difference. Not to mention, I didn't speak even a word of Japanese. But my work demanded me to be there, so I had no choice but to go. When I first landed, the difference in everything was very striking, but slowly I adapted myself and became accustomed to their ways of life. There were many things I loved about Japan. One of them is their train service. Back in the States, I had to drive for hours to get from one place to another. There was no way around driving. If you had to get places, you were forced to have a car. After moving here, I got a much-needed break from behind the wheel. Almost everything here is within walking distance from my apartment, and I take a train every morning to my office. The work environment is very good, and all the people, friends or strangers, are extremely kind. Not to mention the women are extremely beautiful too. As I made friends in my office, I got to learn a lot about Japanese culture from them. So all of them had been to the States, so they knew the difference between Japan and the US. But the ones who hadn't left Japan were very curious regarding my life back home. We usually had lunch together during our breaks, and while the Japanese cuisine was growing on me, so was the culture. During one of our lunch breaks, Sandro Yoshida, a Japanese-British colleague of mine, asked me, "Zach, you travel by train every day. So, do you know the legend of Tek-Tek?" This was the first time I was hearing about Tek-Tek. I had heard a lot of stories about Japan and its history, but nothing about Tek-Tek.
exactly.
No. What is a Tek-Tek?
You don't tell him
I
you
asked
don't
innocently.
speak, 'cause he probably
Suddenly, the
never
whole
noticed.
table fell silent. It was like I'd asked a stupid question. All 7 members sitting around the table were just staring at me. Sandro continued, "It's an urban legend." Oh, another urban legend. Sounds interesting. What's it about? I asked, very excited to know more about this story. "Well, not long ago, when the Japanese train service started, not many people knew how to navigate it. It was pretty new for everyone. A girl who wanted to travel by train met with an accident. She fell on the track and the fast train went over her body, splitting her in half. Her head was separated from the rest of her body. Back then, it was big news, and after her accident, many more safety measures were taken. Passengers were educated on how to travel by train. The death of that girl was national news for days. But that's not the scary part. If anything, her death increased the safety of the other passengers. However, over the years there had been many reports of people traveling by train late and spotting a head of a woman floating in trains or on railway stations.
You see? Now
This
he got
head
confused.
looked exactly like the deceased girl, with long flowy straight hair. Whoever is unfortunate enough to be spotted by this head dies the same way that girl died. This is called the urban legend of Tek-Tek, Sandro told me. So far, I had not encountered anything other than present strangers on the train, and I didn't believe in such urban legends. A woman's head floating around in trains and platforms. Are you kidding me? It even sounded absurd. But seeing the looks everyone was giving me, I didn't dare to crack a joke. Instead, I asked the most obvious question.
Respectful.
Has any one of you seen a Tek-Tek? No. Most of them shook their heads. This confirmed my suspicion internally. This was just a made-up story to scare children from traveling at night. But Haru, one of my female colleagues, looked dead serious.
I haven't, but my father has. He was a factory worker a decade ago and had worked in shifts.
Okay.
One night, when he was taking the train to go for his night shift, hardly anyone was there on the platform. He was waiting for his train when he spotted something slithering between the train tracks. At first he thought it was a rodent or perhaps a stray cat, but when he looked closer, he spotted the wide red eyes, the feminine features, and he instantly knew it was Tek-Tek. Before the head could spot him, he rushed back home. He never took the train again after sunset. I know this may seem like a joke to you, but it's true. Many people have died due to Tek-Tek.
Well, I believe it if you say so. I didn't want to argue with Haru. She could be a stubborn woman sometimes. Many months passed after our lunch conversation about Tek-Tek. To be honest, I'd totally forgotten about that urban legend altogether. I still took the train and enjoyed not having to drive everywhere. Plus, I was getting more and more comfortable in my life in Japan. Most days of the week, I used to get home by 7 in the evening. But on this one particular day, all of my colleagues and I decided to go out for dinner and drinks to celebrate our successful completion of a project. Although I was not much into it, I decided to go along, not wanting to disappoint anyone. By the time we were all done with food and the alcohol, it was midnight. I wasn't drunk, as I had nothing but 2 beers, but the others were pretty wasted. I made sure everyone had a ride home, and then I walked towards the train station. It was my first time traveling at this hour, so I was surprised to see that the platform was completely empty. Not a single soul besides me was in sight.
Yeah,
There were 10 minutes
Everybody
before my
was
train
like
got there, so
around.
I decided to just sit on the bench and wait. I scrolled through my phone, and suddenly, from the corner of my eyes, I saw something moving under the bench opposite to mine. At first, I ignored it, but when I got a good look, I was running out of the train station like a madman. Right there in front of me was the head of a human woman, and it was moving in circles and weird patterns. There was straight jet-black flowy hair attached to it, and saucer-big eyes. That's when I remembered the urban legend of Tek-Tek.
I hate when y'all
and
remember
knew
after.
that it was
Like, how
indeed
you gonna
real.
remember something that they just
As
told
I
you?
ran, I thought that the head had not spotted me. But then I turned around, and the head was slithering behind me.
Oh, she did.
It had spotted me, and now it was
She
chasing
did you.
me. I didn't want to die a violent death, so I ran as fast as I could, and finally I got out of the train station. Still, there were no people around. That's when I spotted the silhouette of a woman. From a distance, I could only see her body up to her shoulders. When I took a closer look,
No head.
I saw that she didn't have a head.
Ah.
Instead, she stooped below and picked up the slithered head.
Oh.
I was terrified looking at this headless woman with her head in her hand. This was Tek-Tek, and people didn't know the whole story of this urban legend. It was not just a slithering head of a woman hunting people, but it was a headless body as well.
Ah.
To date, I cannot forget the sight of that horrific woman. It's etched into my brain. Luckily, Tek-Tek doesn't follow anyone out of the train station, and I narrowly escaped her wrath.
Narrowly.
Although I'm still in Japan, and I still use the railway every day, I never travel by train after sunset. And now when anyone tells me about urban legends, instead of laughing at them, a small part of me actually believes them.
As you should. Boy, you almost died. Like, come on now. I want to sit here and say instead of laughing, what you laughing for? That woman had knees to chest on your back. On your back. What? Yes. So, indeed, I will tag the other one because, stop it. I love a good urban legend stories. This one was good. The last one was good. I'm just excited with it. This one was really good. The last one, really good. What pissed me off is when people don't listen. Like, you don't have to be, oh, I believe, but you don't have to play dumb either. Don't sit here and play dumb. Like that man, his parents told him before. If he would have told his son, I'm sure he would have been like, hey, dad, ain't you think it's a little too late? You know, don't you think we're running too far? Open our eyes. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know which one was your favorite. Let me know your favorite urban legend. And please, 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 again, like the video for me. I love you guys. And until next time, bye.